Step into a world of romance and mystery with Tamora Rose. Today we're reading Chapter 1 from Child of the Wind. The stench of death was everywhere. It wafted from the darkened bedchambers, drifted up from the ancient dining hall, and blew in from the abandoned servants' quarters. Blood covered the stairs, forcing Alan Charles, Duke of Suffolk, to keep one hand on the railing as he worked his way to the second floor. His sword was out and ready, for from the looks of things they'd arrived far too late for that sword to be of any use. "Your Grace," one of his men shouted from above. Still watching his step, the Duke rushed forward but lowered his sword. If there had been any danger, his men would have said so. Steeling himself against what he might find, Alan made his way down the shadowy corridor and into the master bedchamber. At first there wasn't much to see. The room was dark, lit only by the moon shining through the large windows. The massive bed was draped with heavy curtains to protect against the evening's chill. His man, the one who'd called out to him, stood near the bed. When young Bryce didn't turn to acknowledge the Duke, Alan knew something had caught the man's eye. Alan moved forward and reached out a hand to pull aside the velvet curtain blocking his view. He almost immediately dropped it again. He didn't need to see the ruined face of his friend, the Earl of Barsland, to know the man was dead. "Where's his wife?" the Duke asked, letting his eyes dart around the room as he sheathed his sword. Bryce swallowed hard. "The Countess is in the dressing room." The Duke nodded and moved away, keeping his eyes from the bed. The moment he entered the dressing room, he wished he'd stayed in the bedchamber. The Countess, the lovely Dawn, lay on her back, naked and spread-eagled. She'd clearly been raped before she'd been killed. The look of frozen horror on her face and the position of her body said as much. Alan pulled a dressing gown off a hook and spread it over her cold flesh. Turning to leave, he spotted a young servant in the corner. She couldn't have been more than 15, the age of his own sweet daughter. The servant had also been assaulted before death. He strode through the bedroom, kept his eyes off the blood-soaked bed, and very nearly ran into his eldest son. Edward, barely 17, was nearly white and looked about ready to vomit. Alan didn't blame him. There was enough blood in this place to turn the stomach of even a hardened soldier. Edward swallowed hard. "The servants are all dead. All of them. All." Alan nodded and led his son out the door, leaving the bedchamber behind. Edward didn't need to see the Earl, a man who'd been like a second father to the lad in his current state. And he certainly didn't need to see the Countess. "And the boys?" the Duke asked. The Earl had 3 sons. The oldest was almost 10 years old. The youngest was barely 3. Edward grew even paler, if that was even possible. Dead in their beds. They were torn apart. And the baby? His son stopped in his tracks. "I didn't even think about her. I didn't check the nursery." If there was even a chance that the Earl's daughter might still be alive, he had to know. Motioning for his son to follow, Alan headed straight to where he knew the nursery would be. Dawn had never liked being separated from her children when they were only babies, and she and her husband had always shared the same bed, so the Countess's bedchamber had been converted into a nursery many years ago. It was even connected through a small door hidden behind a tapestry, though he doubted anyone other than the Countess actually used that door, since it led through a little-used closet and into the adjacent dressing room. The nursery was a mess. 2 nursemaids, one barely old enough to leave the nursery herself, lay on the floor. A woman he recognized as the wet nurse was sprawled on a nearby chest. Their clothing had been torn from their bodies, telling him they'd clearly suffered the same fate as most of the women in the manor. The Duke stepped over them. His son did not follow. Chairs were overturned, baby clothing and blankets were strewn everywhere, and the crib had been all but destroyed. Someone had been looking for something. Or someone. The baby? It seemed likely. And if she'd been in there, they'd found her. Alan almost searched for her, almost looked for the tiny body he was sure to find, but he changed his mind before lifting the first torn sheet. Seeing the mutilated body of his friend's infant daughter might just be too much for him. Nodding to himself, the Duke moved back to the door. "She's not here," he said to his son. "Dead?" Edward asked, voice just a little strained. "In all likelihood." The wind picked up just as he moved back into the hall. It wailed, making eerie sounds as it passed through the windows. Father and son moved away, intending to rejoin the men searching the house below. Alan's foot had just hit the top of the stairs when a sound, low and almost feral, drifted towards them. "What's that?" Edward asked as he turned towards the sound. He didn't know what it was, not exactly, but he knew he had to find out. The Duke turned on his heel and almost ran back into the nursery. Another low mewl, this one definitely closer, echoed through the room, followed by the high-pitched cry of a baby. Edward rushed into the nursery, eyes wide. "Where is she?" The young man was careful not to so much as glance at the bodies on the floor as he looked around. "I don't know," the Duke replied, his eyes darting around the room. "Find her." Together they searched under the scattered clothing and bedclothes. Still no baby, but the crying was louder now, and was almost certainly coming from this room. Or was it? Alan listened carefully and found himself drawn to the far wall, the one that separated the nursery from the Countess's dressing room. His hand touched the thick tapestry covering the wall, and suddenly it hit him. "Here!" he called as he ripped the tapestry away from the wall, exposing the small door behind it. His son ran towards him just as he pushed the door inward. The baby's cries grew louder, and Alan knew he'd found her. "Bring a light!" He couldn't see the baby and didn't want to risk crushing her. It wasn't long in appearing. Edward darted out of the room and reappeared a moment later with a torch in hand. With its flickering light guiding him, it took the Duke only a moment to lay his hand on the squirming bundle of swaddling in the corner. As soon as he lifted the baby in his arms, she started screaming. The little mite probably needed to be fed, but since her mother and her wet nurse were both dead, there was no one to feed her right now. The poor child would have to wait. Holding her tight, the Duke crawled out of the closet and back into the nursery. Her screaming got louder and her pitch higher, and there was not a damn thing he could do about it. "How the hell did they miss that?" Edward asked as he backed away from the angry infant. Alan spoke over the infuriated shrieks. If her mother hid her, and the intruders didn't know about the closet, and the baby stayed quiet, it's likely they would never have known she was here. "You really think that thing stayed quiet?" The Duke almost laughed. Her pitch suddenly rose higher still, causing his son to flinch. A half smile curving his lips, Alan put the baby to his shoulder. He was a father 3 times over. He knew a little about babies. He had just reached the top of the wide staircase when the little girl let out a soft burp and immediately quieted. His son looked at him in surprise. "How did you do that?" "I must have learned a few things from your mother." His son followed. "Who did this?" Edward finally asked as he made his own careful way down the stairs. "Who hated the Earl enough to slaughter his entire household?" The Earl of Barsland was, one of the richest men in the country. Any number of people hated him. Enough to kill his entire family. The Duke glanced over his shoulder. "Who inherits if the Earl has no living issue?" Edward stopped. "I have no idea. He has no brothers, no sisters. I don't even think he has any distant cousins." "There's one," Alan replied, answering his own question. "One cousin, but he hasn't been seen in a decade. Not since he tried to claim the earldom over Garrick. I suppose it doesn't matter since she's alive. The king is sure to recognize her claim to the earldom." Edward started down the stairs again. I forgot her name." The baby? The girl was still mercifully quiet in his arms. Canace, you were at the christening, Edward. That doesn't mean I was paying attention. He frowned. Canace isn't an English name. No, I think it's Greek. Or Roman, maybe. The baby squirmed on his shoulder. Alan patted her back in an effort to keep her quiet. Around them, they could hear the sounds of men moving bodies and riding furniture. The cleanup would take days. The stench of death would linger even longer. But at least whoever had done this had missed the baby. The baby? What happens to her? Edward asked, almost as if he'd read his father's thoughts. With no living family, I assume that will be for the king to decide. They were now almost outside. Alan paused. Find me a blanket for the little one. Something without blood on it, preferably. Edward nodded and hurried to do as he was bid. There was a small sitting room off to the left, one that had been empty at the time of the slaughter. Hopefully he could find something to wrap the baby in. Sure enough, there was a clean blanket draped across the back of a chair. Scooping it up, he headed back to the foyer. Alan nodded his thanks as he wrapped Canace in the proffered blanket. The baby squirmed but stayed quiet. Once she was as warm as she was going to get, he stepped out into the cold summer night. There are men out here as well, some of them dragging slaughtered horses out of the stables. Whoever had done this had been determined that none would survive. It was senseless butchery on a massive scale. But why? To destroy an entire family? The motive had to be money, but even that didn't explain the massacre. The sound of distant hoofbeats disrupted his thoughts and had him immediately on alert. Since he was holding an infant, he didn't draw his sword. Instead, he backed against the nearest wall as Edward and several of the men nearest them all palmed their blades. They needn't have bothered with the precautions. The men who clattered into the courtyard belonged to the king. Both Edward and Alan recognized several of them, including their old friend Duncan McKenna. McKenna wasn't exactly one of the king's men, but he was an ally of the English crown and a great friend to the Earl of Barsland. McKenna dismounted and approached, dismissing the gathered men with a wave of his hand. What happened here? Edward sheathed his sword and stepped forward. Wholesale slaughter, Mac. The Scotsman's eyes widened. And Garrick? Now Alan stepped out of the shadows, baby still held firmly in his arms. The Earl is dead, Mac, and his wife and all 3 sons. The entire household. The dead horses, dogs, and servants in the courtyard indicated that it was so. Alan's nod only confirmed it. All except the baby girl. The Duke pulled aside the blanket, revealing the swaddled child sleeping on his shoulder. McKenna reached out and took the child from the Duke of Suffolk. Since Mac was one of the Earl's oldest friends, the Duke did not object. Little Canace, Mac whispered as he cradled the infant. She opened her eyes, screwed up her little face, then thought better of it and cooed at the Scotsman instead. He chuckled down at her. Alan and Edward exchanged a surprised glance. She doesn't cry for you, Edward remarked sourly. She likes me, Mac returned, keeping his voice pitched low. I don't frighten the lass. Are you sure she's the only one left? Edward grimaced. The boys are dead. I saw their bodies myself. Then the little one is now one of the richest heiresses in England. The baby waved her little arms, prompting Mac to coo softly. We'll have to find a wet nurse for the lass. Alan nodded. We'll find one in London. That's where she goes, at least until the king decides what to do with her. Then he'll be responsible for keeping her safe from whoever did all this. You think she was a target? They were certainly looking for her, the Duke insisted. The nursery was torn apart. They wanted the baby dead as much as they wanted anything else. Mac glanced at the Duke. Then we'd better get her to London. The 3 men nodded in agreement. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this chapter, stay tuned for more tales of romance. Until we meet again, may your days be filled with passion and just a touch of magic.